Here we are on part B, section B, whatever you want to call it, of the deadly sins that we started on Monday evening. So on Monday, we looked at the first three of the deadly sins. Just to remind you, or for the new people who need to go and listen to it again, the 7 deadly sins are the 7 out of the 17 competencies that the DVSA have told us that driving instructors consistently score lower on. Now, this data comes from standards checks because they don't have that data for part 3s. I'm not sure whether they just don't keep the data, but they certainly don't have that data to be able to tell us. However, as I said to you on Monday night, there is no good reason to believe that you guys don't fall into the same traps that driving instructors do. So we're going to presume that the 7 deadly sins are absolutely the 7 deadly sins that also happen on a part 3. And actually, if I'm going to be brutally honest, I will say 100% that is right, okay, from my experience, from the forms that I'm seeing, from what you guys are saying. We also, I think it was last Wednesday, talked about the terrible 2, so those 2 extra deadly sins that I am adding in there. So if you haven't listened to that, you need to go back and review that, because those 2 extra sins are the ones that are very PDI specific. So really, really specific to you guys from part 3, far more so than ADIs. So here we are with the last 4 competencies. Now, I surpassed myself on Monday by finishing on time, which was a miracle. I don't think it's ever happened before. And here I have 1 extra competency to get in. So let's see how we can do. So we are going to start off with competency number 4. Competency number 4 is the first one in your teaching and learning strategies. So I'm going to read it out for you. Was the teaching style suited to the pupil's learning style and current ability? So that is number 4 of your deadly sins. Was the teaching style suited to the pupil's learning style and current ability? So this is number 1 in your teaching and learning strategies. Now, just a point of note about this competency, and we probably will kind of revisit it, but if this is a 1 or a 0, but certainly if this is a 1, the one under it will also be a 1, as probably the one under that will be a 1 as well. So it's not unusual for me to look at a form like this and see a beautiful example of 1s in those first 3 boxes in your teaching and learning strategies. Hope I'll make that clear about why that's going to happen, why there's a potential for that to happen as we go on. So as ever, what I'm going to do is start by reading you the DVSA ADI 1. So again, if you are new to this, you need to go and download yourself a copy of the DVSA ADI 1. Now that's the Examiner's Guidelines to Driving Instructor Tests. So it's the Examiner's Bible. So basically, whatever the examiner is looking for a PDI or an ADI to do on their part 2, their part 3, their standards check or audit check is in there. And it's a really easy worded document. And what you will find if you find your part 3 section is it lays out the 17 competencies in black and white, beautifully paragraphed out. And in each incident, or in most incidents, it gives a competence and a lack of competence. In other words, do this and it will be a 3, do this and it won't be a 3 anymore. So it's a great little tool. I'm going to read it out to you so that you know what the DVSA are saying about it. And then, as ever, I'm just going to make it instructor friendly for you. So I'm going to make it make sense, perhaps give you some examples to help clarify what it is that we're talking about. So here we are. Was the teaching style suited to the pupil's learning style and current ability? The PDI should take into account all that they understand about the pupil. They should recognise that different pupils will have different preferred approaches to learning, although these may only emerge over a number of lessons. Some pupils may be very willing to learn actively, and others may want opportunities to reflect before they make the next step in their learning. The PDI should at least be able to give evidence of their sensitivity to these issues. In a one-off session, this will probably be best demonstrated by offering a range of options. The PDI should be able to adjust their approach if evidence emerges of a preferred different style. It's impossible to force learning on a pupil. Progress is always determined by what the pupil is comfortable with. The skill is recognizing when the pupil stops learning. I want you to hold that point. You might even want to write it down. The skill is recognizing when the pupil stops learning. The pace of the session should be set by the pupil. On the other hand, the pupil should not be talked out of experimenting if this is within safe boundaries. When coaching, the PDI should ensure that the tools used are suitable. If a question and answer technique is used, this should match the pupil's level of ability and encourage them to use a higher level of thinking to give a response. Asking closed questions of a pupil who is demonstrating a high level of ability, unless it's to check knowledge, is of little use. Asking open questions to a pupil of limited ability who's finding it difficult to achieve the task that they've set for themselves may be very confusing. There are no hard or fast rules. The effectiveness of any question has to be assessed given the circumstances at the time. Then we have a list of lack of competency. So in other words, if you see the PDI doing this, and this, chances are it's a 3. And then the lack of competencies. We're going to read you out the lack of competencies. So in other words, don't do any of these. Adopting a teaching style clearly at odds with the pupil's learning style. Failing to check with the pupil whether the approach they are taking is acceptable. Failing to explore other ways of addressing a particular learning point. Concentrating on delivering tools rather than looking for learning outcomes, or ignoring safety issues. So let's make this simple for you. It doesn't matter whether you're talking a pupil through something. It doesn't matter whether you're asking Q&A. It doesn't matter whether you're giving some prompts. It doesn't matter if you've left them to be independent. It doesn't matter if you're offering a demonstration. It doesn't matter whether you're watching somebody else do it. It doesn't matter if you're standing on a bridge looking over the roundabout watching everyone else cock it up. It doesn't matter if you've got your magnetic cars out. It doesn't matter if you're drawing on a whiteboard. It doesn't matter if you're watching a YouTube clip. As long as it's appropriate and it works. It's as simple as that. So it doesn't matter what you're doing as long as it's appropriate and it works. So in other words, this competency is there to basically throw the net out there to catch the wide variety of teaching tools and techniques that we all use that are appropriate to the pupils that we're using. Now, this is very much steeped in history. The old Part 3, the old traditional way of teaching people to drive was very set in stone. It was very instructor-led. This is recognizing that that one-size-fits-nobody approach is no longer appropriate. Now there's a recognition that driving instructors are out there doing this and saying that and using this and watching that, and it's working. And therefore, we need to have a system that recognizes that driving instructors are using these things. Ta-da! Here is this system. So this is this box. Doesn't matter what you're doing as long as the style or teaching tools and techniques that you're using are appropriate to the pupils. In other words, matching the pupil's learning style. Now, one of the sentences that I asked you to listen to there was that the skill is in recognizing when the pupil stops learning. That's your key skill there. Any of you who visit Facebook fairly regularly, particularly if you are members of other groups, I know it doesn't happen on our group, thank goodness, but you will probably notice driving instructors who say things like, what is it about this generation? If I've had to say something 50 times, I've had to say it 100. What don't they get? Okay, you'll see it all the time, okay? All the time, drives me a little bit mad. If you've said something 50 times, saying it another 50 times is not going to suddenly make them get it. If you've had to say something 50 times, they weren't getting it in the first place. So repeating the same thing again and again and again is not going to suddenly magically work. It's a little bit like speaking loudly and slowly to a foreign person. If they don't know the words, it doesn't matter how loudly or slowly you talk, it's not going to make any sense. If a pupil doesn't get it, it's not the pupil's fault. It's a challenge for you. Okay, so that's the way you're needing to think about it. If the pupil doesn't get it, what are you going to do to change what you're doing in recognition that learning is not taking place and they need something different? Okay, that's what that competency is basically meaning. I guess the other trap, which we kind of hinted on in the lack of competency, is basically choosing a teaching style, sticking with that teaching style, and not developing it further. So in other words, it becomes a teaching style rather than the pupil's learning style. And so you guys need to be very aware of the teaching style that you fall into, because if you are a natural teller, you'll probably be telling. If you're a natural instructor, you'll probably be instructing. If you're a natural person who enjoys perhaps visually looking at something, the chances are you're going to be drawn to visually looking at something. So out will come your diagrams or out will come a YouTube clip. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's the pupil's preferred style, but if it's your preferred teaching style, it's probably the one that will seep out, if you like. So to be very aware of it. Great if that matches your pupil, not if it doesn't. So if you're somebody who's very good at telling and explaining and demonstrating, yet your pupil learns best from doing it themselves, you can see that that's where you have the clash of teaching and learning styles together. So this is what it's basically implying, is that it needs to match your pupil. And what you might have also heard in there, where it says that probably in a one-off session, this is best demonstrated by the PDI offering a range of choices. So in other words, this isn't little old you with your menu and the pupil has got to choose the one thing off the menu that you are telling them they've got to use. You're going to offer a menu of choices. So there's no reason why you can't be saying to the pupil, what will work for you? Do you want to have a little look at a diagram? Do you want me to show you? Shall I talk you through it, or do you want to have a go? It doesn't matter what it is. And those are just 4 I picked off the top of my head. But the point being that whatever the pupil best suits is what the pupil is going to choose for themselves. So if you had a pupil who wants to have a go and is very good at experimental learning and self-reflecting, they're not going to say, oh, could you offer me a demonstration, please, Louise? Because that's not the style. If there's somebody who would prefer to be watching somebody else do it and then to imitate or copy it, they're not going to say, oh, can I have a go? They're going to say, can you show me? So you can see that just by offering the pupil the ability to make a decision about what works for them, the chances are they're going to pick a style that works for them. And this is one of the things that can often happen, is that a driving instructor can think that they know what the pupil needs rather than actually asking or being prepared to do something different. Now, in terms of learning styles, you may have a trainer who goes on and on about learning styles. You may be involved in other Zooms. You may have various other resources that you're using, of which the people that are training you are fairly passionate about learning styles. There are numerous learning styles, but I'm pretty sure that most of you know the difference between a visual learner or the kinesthetic learner, those type of learning styles that people talk about. Learning styles more recently have been poo-pooed, if you like, have been flawed, have had a little bit of kind of jury's out type of feeling about them. And actually, the overall feeling now about learning styles is that a lesson that incorporates every learning style is better than just focusing on one. So people actually learn best from a mixture or match kind of approach, rather than a this is what we are going to do. So over the course of your learning journey with the pupil, the chances are there are some things that they might benefit from having a scribble on a whiteboard with. There are some things that might benefit from a visual YouTube clip of. There are some things that they'd like to just have a little go at, and there's some things they might want to be talked through out. And actually, evidence suggests that mixture and match is the thing that makes most sense and people will learn the best from. So I guess what I'm trying to say is not to make any assumptions about what it is that your pupil needs, and to be ready, willing and able to adapt when you need to. What you're absolutely going to get criticised for is continuing with the same learning style throughout the whole of the lesson when clearly that's demonstrated as not being appropriate. Okay, if you're not winning, if it's not working, then something has to change. So that comes back to that sentence of the skill is recognizing when learning isn't taking place or stopped taking place. In terms of you guys, so let's make it even more specific to you guys from a PDI point of view. This is probably the one that is most related to your over instruction and your under instruction. So we can look at it as simple as that in terms of the level that you have set and that you're doing with the pupil. And out of all of those, more often than not, it will be an over instruction, so a tendency to tell rather than a tendency to ask, that would be the thing that would get people into the most stick, if you like, okay? The most trouble. So that instructor-led kind of feeling about it, not being in the moment, not recognizing if people need something different. But probably that is, I'll stick my neck on the line and say that my evidence suggests that that is the thing that gets people the most points, most 1 points, if you like, and no higher. So I'm going to leave that competency there. Any questions or that have come up as I've talked about that one?
Yeah, we've got a few. We've got one from Stephen. On a part 3, the chances are you're already aware of the pupil's learning style. So should you redo it on the part 3?
No, I don't think it's a case of redoing it, but it's a case of not making an assumption that that will continue for the next 45 minutes to be the case, because it could be that something happens that means that it would be more relevant to do something else. In terms of confirming with a pupil, then within that 2-minute period where you've stopped the lesson to pick up an examiner, the examiner jumps into the back of the car, you have that quick recap of, come on then, Bob's just jumped in the back, tell me what we've just been working on. And the pupil says, oh, we've just been doing speed and approach to roundabouts. How's that been going? Oh, it's been going quite well. I'm getting the hang of it. Should we carry on doing what we're doing then? And I'll keep prompting you like we were doing just before we came and picked up Bob. And then when you feel like you're getting it, we'll look at whether you can take some more responsibility and I can back off. Sound like a plan? Off we go. So you can see that within that, I am confirming a level of instruction. And what are pupils going to do? Pupils going to continue to be prompted and give it a go, and we're going to evaluate it each time. So you're going to recap it, but it's not as black and white as, so tell me what learning style we've been using. You know, it's not like that. Okay, bear with me. Can you just do that for me?
And Philip has a good question there as well. So with the part 3 being sort of a rolling lesson, can we get them to stop and draw a diagram, you know, or stop and watch other drivers doing something? I don't see kind of how you could do that without being told off, sort of thing.
If that's what the pupil needs, that's what the pupil needs. And again, I think that this is, again, this kind of hangover of a wheels moving lesson. They want the car to be continuously moving. We're not allowed to pull over. If your pupil is not getting something and is going to get it by drawing a diagram, and that helps them to think in their mind, oh God, I get it now, learning then takes place. That 2 minutes that you spent doing that was absolutely 100% worth it. You will fail for not doing it. You'll have an examiner who'll get to the end of the test and say, why didn't you just stop and show them a diagram? That would have made them go ping. So it's not a case of you imposing your style. So if you were to stop the car and impose your style on somebody, so to do the whole, so I'm going to get a diagram out, I'm going to tell you what it is that we should be doing, that clearly isn't appropriate. But if the pupil's not getting it and you've talked it through or you've asked them some questions and something's still not going in, your opportunity to recognize that and change what you're doing is exactly what is needed. Okay, so yeah, absolutely be doing that.
Jason says, can you please explain what the phrase means of giving technical incorrect instructional information? Maybe by way of an example. I'm an engineer, so I have a predetermined definition of technical.
Okay, that's a different competency, so that's not a deadly sin. I wonder whether it would be useful whether we took the competencies that I've not mentioned within the deadly sins and did a whole webinar about the ones that aren't deadly sins. Would that be useful? So we're not skipping over all of them, but to not sidetrack and go technical information, but to add that to a webinar where we look at all the other competencies. Yeah, okay, let's do that then. So I will answer the question, but in another webinar where I can go into it in some more detail and make sense.
Sorry, Jason's just put there, it is a bullet point under this competency in the ADI 1 as part of the competence, lack of competence.
It would be it would be a point of note, but it's not the most relevant thing in this situation, if you see what I mean. Let me just, so that I'm not skirting the question, because I know that that's not, it's not appropriate for you guys to go away with not having the answer. Technical information basically is not necessarily mechanical technical information. It could be. So if you are absolutely getting your mechanical information wrong, which I'll tell you a story about in a moment, then yes, that would it would come under the technical box. But technical information, majority of the time, means rules, regulations, and routines. Okay, so the rules, the laws, regulations, and routines. Basically, anything DVSA-ish, anything highway code-ish, anything in DES is technical information. So, for example, telling a pupil to find the bite before they set the gas, that's technically incorrect information. DES says we set gas and we find bite. So things like that would be criticised. Not teaching within MSPSL or not recognising faults within MSPSL would be technical information. Okay, so that's, don't necessarily think mechanical. However, let me give you a little story about my last standards check. The last standards check I took up a pupil who'd never driven before. It was her first lesson. I didn't know her. I picked her up 20 minutes before my standards check. We were obviously doing a little bit of moving off and stopping, and never, ever, ever in my 13 years of being an instructor has a pupil ever said to me, "Louise, how does a clutch work?" And my pupil on the day didn't ask me how a clutch worked. But I found myself sitting there saying, "So underneath the bonnet is this coggy wheelie thing that's going round, and then there's another wheelie coggy thing going round, and this," and I'm thinking, what am I talking about? I have no idea what I'm banging my hands together and doing all of this. I have got no idea what I'm talking about. She didn't ask me. I found myself in test mode going, look at me and my technical information. I didn't have a clue what I was talking about. I dropped a point on my technical information on my standards drawing with an examiner who said, "Louise, you might want to go off and look up how a clutch works." Okay, so don't go anywhere that you don't get, if you see what I mean. Okay, so that was absolutely technical information, and that was one of the 2 points that I lost on a standards check. So rules, routines, and regulations, and mechanics as well, if you want to throw some mechanics in there. That's basically what that is meaning. But DVSA talk, we can sum it up by that. DVSA talk, words they use, they're expecting you to be using them too. Anything else, Laura, in terms of this competency before I move on?
Not quite. I don't know if Neil wanted to unmute and talk about his scoring, because he had a sort of a query about that, or whether Neil was happy to leave that. I'm not sure.
We can do that, or we can do that separately as we move on. If it's Neil, who I think it is, if it's yes. Neil, Neil, I think we're going to take your fail focus.
It's interesting because it was a different way of getting a 1 in that box. Because okay. I got, when you said that the other boxes should be a 1, I looked down and mine were 2s, because I think I got my 1 because I got my 1 from lesson planning in the first place. Because if you look at it, if your lesson plan, if you in terms of adapting to a pupil's needs, if you get that wrong, then this box must be a 1 as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I just wanted to sort of mention that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Neil. If the lesson that you are delivering is not appropriate to that pupil, of course, clearly it suggests that there's going to be a problem with the style that you're using, because however good the style is, it's no longer appropriate for what that pupil needed. So yeah, absolutely, Neil. And I think that we're going to look at your fail focus on a Sunday as well, so we can go into that in detail.
I just wanted to, I mean, it's something that perhaps some people that haven't done this yet perhaps don't realise is I thought, because I was quite strong in that teaching aspect, that you would still get marks for that, but actually when you realise that actually you get a 1 in 1 box and it throws all, that's why I got the 2s underneath, because I was still doing that bit well, but I was doing, but it can offset the entire test by just getting.
Absolutely, absolutely. And not just that competency. You're absolutely right. I hope that one of the things that you guys gained from these Zooms and looking at these competencies and listening to the fail focuses in particular is that you'll recognize that it is that house of cards. You know, when one thing is wrong, so many other things come toppling down. So you're right, and it's not a competency in its own little individual box. It does have a total knock-on effects. Absolutely. Okie doke. Let's move on to the next competency. So the next competency down is, was the pupil encouraged to analyse problems and take responsibility for their learning? So this absolutely makes sense that if you're going to have a problem with your teaching style, particularly if you've got a problem with your over-instructing and your telling, that it makes sense that there'll probably be a knock-on effect with your, was the pupil encouraged to analyse problems and take responsibility for learning? So I'm going to read you out as I do in the ADI 1 and then make it make sense for you. Was the pupil encouraged to analyse problems and take responsibility for their learning? The key part of the client-centred approach is development of active problem solving in the pupil. This means that the PDI has to provide time for this to happen and has to stop talking for long enough for the pupil to do the work. The key thing to remember, however, is that different pupils will respond to this invitation in different ways. Some may be able to do it instantly in a discussion, others may need to go away and reflect upon a particular problem. They may need to be pointed at reading or other inputs to help them get a handle on the issue. Pushing a pupil to come up with the answers on the spot may be unproductive for some. Lack of competence includes, so don't do any of these, leaving the pupil feeling that the PDI was in control of the teaching process. Failing to explore alternative ways of addressing a problem in response to evidence of a different learning preference, or providing unsuitable or incorrect inputs. So this is really interesting. Leaving the pupil feeling that the PDI was in control of the teaching process. We can sum up that line by saying over-instructing. Yeah, I think that you guys know that enough now to know that if you're over-instructing, you're giving that vibe of being in control. Okay, so absolutely dominating a situation. So telling, sorting out, problem solving for a pupil, analysing for a pupil, rectifying things for a pupil, coming up with solutions, and just generally taking too much responsibility for a pupil. And that's basically what they're saying, but they're saying leaving the pupil feeling that PDI was in control of the teaching process. So in other words, an instructor-led lesson. As instructors, we are really, really good at taking responsibility for pupils, really good at it. Most of the time, we think we're doing it because we're being helpful. And in fact, a lot of the time, we don't even know that we're doing it. So let me give you an example. At the end of the road, turn left. Who identified the end of the road? Me. So pupil hasn't even had to identify an end of the road. At the roundabout, take the third exit right. Who identified that we were coming up to a roundabout? Me. I took responsibility for that. What do you think the traffic lights might do? Oh, are there some traffic lights? You know, who identified the traffic lights? Who even hinted that they might do something? Me. Okay, so just simple things like that. You'll be surprised that within your level of instruction, even if that level of instruction is correct, and I'm not saying those things aren't correct, but we have to acknowledge that we're taking responsibility. Looking far ahead, what do you see when you are meaning the cyclist? Well, who pointed out the cyclist? Me, because I'm saying, what do you see ahead? Tell me your next hazard. In other words, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, there must be a hazard, because Louise doesn't say that if there isn't. So even right down to that kind of stuff, we're taking responsibility. As I said, that's not wrong. We have to do that. That's part of our process. But we have to acknowledge that when we're doing it, we're taking responsibility for things that our pupil needs to take responsibility for sometime in the future. So we need to be thinking of ways that we're developing that skill. Otherwise, we could spend 40 hours not developing that skill in them because we are continuously bringing the prompt. And then you wonder why they commit the faults on a driving test because they have never had to identify a speed hump before in their lives. You've been the one saying, why do you think there are speed humps here? What speed do you think would be appropriate? They've never had to identify them in the first place by a very subtle question or comment or something that you say which controls the lesson. You've taken responsibility. That's a whole nother webinar in itself in terms of how we develop a pupil's responsibility. Because as I've said, those things aren't wrong and they are needed when a pupil is learning. But we need to recognise how much responsibility we're taking just with very simple instructive things that we say and by the pure nature of being in the seat next to them. Okay, that makes a big, big difference. Listen to this example. Oh, that was a little bit fast, wasn't it? Did you feel the car juddering as you went round the corner? If you dropped her down into second gear and killed some of that power before we went round, probably would have felt a little bit more in control than not gone so wide. Who identified the problem? Me. Who analysed it? Me. Who came up with the solution? Me. Did the people do anything? Nope. Yet we think that we're being helpful. I'll give you another example. Well done, really nice roundabout. Loved your mirror checks on your approach. Nice early signal, got yourself into a good lane. Great road position on the roundabout. I can see you've been working on that. Nice mirrors as you came off. Well done. Who analysed that? Me. Who took responsibility for it? Me. Did the people have to do any work? Nope. And we think that we're being helpful. We're over-instructing. Because it's just as important for people to be recognising when they're doing something well as they would be recognising when they're doing something they could be developing. Okay, so this is where you're just going to be very aware of that. And I'm pretty sure that all of you know that on the whole, the ability to be asking a pupil their thoughts, their understanding of what's happened, their analysis of what happened, their development and of their own learning process and planning, that is the way forward. And that's basically what that competency is saying. So allowing the pupil to be responsible for their own learning. Laura, has anything come up?
What can we do if we adapt the lesson to correct a fault, but then the pupil commits more faults before finishing correcting the first one?
Okay. Firstly, you've got to be ready for that because 9 times out of 10 that happens. Secondly, if you have constructed a lesson in an area that's appropriate, you have more control over that than you think. The time that your faults will build and build and build and build will be when something fundamental has gone wrong, either in your level of instruction. So in other words, you have let those things happen because your level of instruction wasn't appropriate in the first place, or you have put a pupil into an environment that is too much for them and therefore they're demonstrating faults because it was too much for them, or, and 9 times out of 10 this is the case, you've done both. Okay, so both those faults happen at once. If you remember back to Mike's lesson, where we had, by the time we pulled over 12 minutes into the lesson, we had so many things that had built up, which we can honestly say that between us all, we worked out was a wrong level of instruction and putting the pupil into an environment that wasn't appropriate. So as simple as controlling what you're doing and allowing the pupil to show you that they can do things before moving the lesson on, you're going to naturally be able to control those type of things. However, there is a possibility that within one junction, for example, you might have numerous faults that happen within MSPSL, so that kind of has happened. What you have to remember is there are not actually that many faults that you can't incorporate and rein right back and sort out the next time you're doing it. So yes, you might do a fault. You might have a pupil who perhaps makes numerous faults on a junction. So let's imagine a pupil turning left out of a junction. They approach it too fast. They don't get their MSPSL in the right time. They end up not having a good look at the junction and coming out of the junction slightly too fast and going a bit wide. So boom, 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 boom. The key is to think, where is the original fault happening? So what is the priority to be controlling? That actually, if I control that particular aspect of it, everything else will sort itself out. And I would suggest something like that. If it's a speed and approach problem, if we sort out the speed, we've then got time to do MSPSL, we've then got time to be in the correct gear, we've then got time to do the looking, we've then got time to control a car that doesn't go wide. So you can see, but by thinking to yourself, right, come on then, we need to analyse this problem. What's the key point that's going wrong here? Sort out the key point, and then I've got enough control to be fixing all that other stuff that is going on. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are having to look at each fault individually. You find the key problem, sort that out, and all the other things will begin to slot into place. Okay. But I would suggest that if you've got faults that are building up that much, it's your level of instruction that is wrong. So the first thing you're going to do is listen to that instructor alarm bell that goes ding-a-ling-a-ling. I'm getting this wrong, not the pupil. Okay, that's the first thing you're going to do when that happens. And rein it right back in, start afresh again at that point. Don't continue for the next 15 minutes with an incorrect level of instruction of people who continues to struggle, because you'll be drowning as well. Okay, the two of you that are struggling.
Stephen then sort of follows on from that and says, does this mean getting the pupil to think of a fix to a fault and then revisiting the same or similar to see if they get it and have an understanding?
Yep, that's this competency. Okay, so that's this competency. So not being the one that controls, unless of course there's a need, unless of course your pupil simply doesn't get it, but it's about the ability to give the people the opportunity to take responsibility for their learning. That's the key point. Let me give you a couple of scenarios on this, because I think it's really useful. I hope it's really useful when you hear other instructors and what they've done. I did some training with a drive instructor on the Isle of Wight. He was a drive instructor who had been an instructor for 37 years, I think, or something, Les, on the Isle of Wight. He's the granddaddy of all the drive instructors on the Isle of Wight. He had some training with me. He wanted to get a 51 out of 51, his standards check, because that was his status on the Isle of Wight. And we did some training, and he went off and did a standards check, and he got 50 out of 51. He was furious. He was so cross that he got 50 out of 51. But the point that he lost the point on was this competency we're talking about. And what it was the people who was continuously committing faults with mirrors and wasn't quite getting it. And Les tried various things, talked about various things, changed what he was saying, etc., etc. And the one thing that was missing out of Les's armour was saying to the pupil, what would work for you? Because clearly the things that I'm doing, what I'm talking about, the questions I'm asking you aren't working. What would work for you? And that's all the examiner said is, why didn't you just turn around and say, what would make this work for you? What would help you get your mirrors right? That was the one question that dropped in that point. Now, on that note, I'm going to give you another example of, it happens to be another driving instructor on the Isle of Wight, but a lovely example of a driving instructor who I trained for her part 3. She passed her part 3. She said to me a few months ago now that she had been training a pupil who was continuously forgetting her left mirror when she was driving. And any of you that have some experience in teaching will know that left mirror tends to be the Cinderella of the mirrors, tends to be the one that gets forgotten the most. So people were struggling with the left mirror. And Bryony said to her pupil, what will work for you? Because I'm going on and on and on about this left mirror, and I'm talking about the relevance of it and the importance of it, and we've talked about the consequences of not checking it. What will work for you? And the pupil said to her, do you know what I need you to do, Bryony? I need you to bring with you on the next lesson something long and pointy. And every time I need to look in that left mirror, I need you to point with the long pointy thing at the left mirror. So Bryony thought, okay, right, I'll do that. I'll go home and I'll find a long pointy thing. So she went home. She said that she walked in and out of various rooms in her house looking for long pointy things. Oh my God, what can I use? What can I bring to this lesson? And she walked into the kitchen, and there in the vegetable rack was the longest, orangest, pointiest carrot you've ever seen. She was just glaring at her, this ginormous carrot in the vegetable rack. And she thought, that's it. That's what I'll bring to my lesson. So she said she took this carrot with her to her driving lesson the following week. She didn't have to point it once because it worked. She just held the carrot. She didn't have to point it once because it worked. And the reason it worked was because it was the pupil's analysis. It was the pupil being responsible for saying, this is what I need you to do. if Bryony had said, I tell you what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring a long, pointy, your orange carrot with me next week, and that will help you do the mirrors. For people who think you've gone crazy, okay, just absolutely mad. And it won't work because it wasn't the people's idea. But the fact that Bryony said she didn't have to point it once, it just worked. So when Bryony was telling me this story, she said, we're going to test next week, Louise, and we're going to bring the carrot. And we're going to ask the examiner just to hold on to the carrot. Ask no questions, just hold the carrot, Mr. Examiner, and see whether that works. I don't know whether they did or not. Can you imagine turning up to your test and just ask the examiner to hold this carrot for us? Don't ask any questions. Anyway, that's the point. The point is that she threw it open to the pupil, said what will work for you, and the pupil came up with a solution that Bryony never would have come up with, and therefore it worked. That's that box. Okay.
And also just another quick question there from Ross. Can we tackle faults by fixing the most safety critical first and then working down them sort of in priority of safety?
The chances are if you're fixing the most safety critical one first, the others will probably sort themselves out as well, because most faults are linked. Okay, most faults are linked one way or another. But yeah, absolutely, sort out your safety critical and bring in the others into that. Yeah, definitely.
Amanda just quickly says as well, was it the fact that the carrot was just there in the car and the people could see it? Or was that sort of what was happening?
It's just a magic carrot, no idea. The bottom line is that we might never know why it worked, but it did. Something worked. Quite probably it was just simply the conversation that had been had in the car the week before that has had a few days just to go in, a little bit of a subliminal message at the point where you produce a carrot, job done. Who knows? Ours is not to ask why. Okay, it just worked. Okay, so I'm going to move on because here we are with 15 minutes to go on the last couple of competencies. So your next competency is, was the pupil given appropriate and timely feedback during the session? And I have to say that if you're scoring ones on the others, it's pretty typical to get a 1 on this one, okay? Particularly if you've got some risk management issues going on, and particularly if that other deadly sin that we talked about on Monday, which was significant feedback given to help the people understand any potentially safety critical incidents. If you've got a 1 on that, chances are you've got a 1 on this one as well. So, as ever, let me read you out the ADI 1 and then make it sense. Was the pupil given appropriate and timely feedback during the session? Feedback is an essential part of learning, but the process must be balanced. The pupil needs to have a clear picture of how they're doing against their learning objectives throughout the lesson. They should be encouraged when performing well and coached when a problem or learning opportunity occurs. However, a constant stream of words, however technically accurate, giving it at an unsuitable time may be demotivating or actually dangerous. Sitting quietly and saying nothing can also be a very powerful form of feedback in some situations. All feedback should be relevant, positive, and honest. It is not helpful if the pupil is given unrealistic feedback, which creates a false sense of their own ability. Where possible, feedback should not be negative. Rather than saying someone has a weakness, consider expressing it as a learning opportunity. However, if they need to be told that something is wrong or dangerous, there's no point in waffling. The pupil should have a realistic sense of their own performance. Feedback is a two-way street. It should ideally be prompted by the pupil, with the PDI responding to the pupil's questions or comments. The pupil's feedback should never be overlooked or disregarded. Indications of lack of competence include providing feedback a long time after an incident so that the pupil cannot link the feedback to what's happened, providing feedback that overlooks the safety critical incident, continuously providing feedback when they may be distracting the pupil, failing to check the pupil's understanding of feedback, providing feedback that is relevant about the pupil's learning objectives, or refusing to hear reasonable feedback about the PDI's own performance. So let me make this simple for you. This means two things. So feedback can mean two things. Feedback can mean what you and I probably imagine it to mean. In other words, I'm going to give you some feedback on something that you've done. Some of you might have heard of the feedback sandwich. Okay, so you say something good, you say something negative or productive or some kind of constructive feedback, and then you say something good again. Again, that's a little bit dissed in terms of the too good stuff tend to be outweighed by the middle stuff that is not particularly good. But that's the kind of feedback we're talking about, that kind of in the true sense of the word. What feedback means possibly more in this situation is anything that comes out of your mouth and goes into the pupil's ears and comes out of the pupil's mouth and goes into your ears. So that's feedback. Anything that comes out of your mouth, be it a question, be it a comment, be it feedback, be it an instruction, you are giving something to the pupil. You are feeding the pupil with something. Okay, so you're feeding the pupil with something. So this is how I want you to think about it. Feed, in other words, I'm going to give you something. The pupil is going to give me something back. That's where you've got your words, feed and back. Okay, so the pupil then feeds you, and then you feed the pupil. And this continuous cycle of talking, of teamwork, of communication, if you like, is what feedback is. Okay, that's what that is meaning. And I want you to think about it in that terms rather than feedback in terms of, oh, you did that really well and maybe you could have improved that, but that wasn't too bad. Yes, that kind of comes into it. And if you look at the competency again in more detail after here, particularly if you look at the indications of lack of competency, you'll see how both those things I'm talking about are made a point of within that lack of competency. Both those areas are covered. But on the whole, I want you to think about feedback being the teamwork approach in which you are feeding each other backwards and forwards. Okay, that's what that is meaning. In terms of the biggest traps that people fall into, feedback that is one way. So absolutely, I'm continuously feeding my pupil, whether they're full or not. Okay, I'm going to continue to feed. Getting your level of instruction wrong, which is why sometimes they go together. In other words, I'm going to continue to spoon feed my pupil, and they don't need it. Okay. Or to not feed my pupil enough. So I have a pupil who's really hungry and I'm not feeding them enough. In other words, they have a need and I'm not feeding the need. So we're going to continue to be thinking about that word feed. Or a pupil who tries to feed you and you don't take it. Okay, you don't listen to what it is that they're saying. You don't take their comments, you don't hear what they're doing, you don't see what they're doing, so therefore you're not responding, because of course feedback can be given in a non-verbal way as well. So think about it in terms of communication, a communication that is a teamwork two-way loop, just continues to go backwards and forwards between the two of you. Waiting too long to have conversations is absolutely up there and one of the biggest things. Okay, so waiting to the point where your pupil is starving before giving them some food, and you can see that from Mick's point of view on his lesson when we watched the lesson last week, where he didn't give feedback, or certainly not enough feedback, until they'd stopped the car 12-13 minutes in, and then there was so much food, there was like an all-you-could-eat banquet to have to discuss, and it was just too much at the point that they stopped. Okay, and the other way of looking at it is to continuously feed the pupil when that then becomes a distraction, and it's not something they need. So continuously bombarding with information or questions or comments, feedback, okay, anything coming out of your mouth when it was just too much and it was distracting a pupil. And I know this kind of conversation comes up quite a bit when we talk about questions and getting questions out and how do we not distract a pupil. The bottom line there is, as long as you are talking about or asking a question that is what you want the pupil to be focusing on, you're not distracting. Because if I'm asking them a question about what it is I want them to be looking for, so where are you looking, is not a distraction, because it's a prompt, if you like. Well, I'm looking to the right, Louise. Great. Okay. That's appropriate to what I want the people to be doing at the moment. So therefore I'm not distracting, it's guiding or prompting. Any questions about that?
None in the chat box related to that. I've got a couple of other questions that can wait till the end.
Okie dokie. Fab. In that case, I'm going to move on to the fourth of the competencies today. And number 7 on your deadly sins. I don't know whether you remembered on Monday night where I told you that if you see or hear the DVSA talk, if you're ever at a meeting or a conference where the DVSA are talking and they're talking about the deadly sins, they don't call them deadly sins, but you'll recognise them as the deadly sins. They now have 5 because it fits better on their slideshow than the original 7. The one that I'm about to say is another one that drops off the list that makes the 7 the 5, but it is absolutely a deadly sin in terms of the original data, and that is, at the end of the session, was the pupil encouraged to reflect on their own performance. At the end of the session was the pupil encouraged to reflect on their own performance. So number 17 on your competency list. As ever, I'll read you out. It's short and sweet in the ADI one. At the end of the session, the pupil should be encouraged to reflect on their performance and discuss their feelings with the PDI. The PDI should encourage honest self-appraisal and use client-centered techniques to highlight areas that need development if the pupil has not recognized them. Once development areas have been identified, the pupil should be encouraged to make them part of future learning. There aren't any indications of competence or lack of competence for this particular competency, although I think we can probably ascertain what they would be. It's not a surprise that this competency is a deadly sin, and the reason it's not a surprise is that if we look at some of the other competencies we've talked about today, about giving feedback and a teaching style being suited to the pupil and a pupil being encouraged to analyse throughout the whole lesson, it's not unusual that if we're getting those wrong for the last 43 minutes, we're not suddenly going to be brilliant at doing it in the last 2 minutes. Because if there is a problem with our teaching style, if there's a problem with our level of instruction, if there's a problem with us encouraging a pupil to analyse, if there's a problem with our feedback, we're not going to suddenly not have the problem at the very end of the part 3. So you can see that some of the indications of lack of competence we could almost take from those other 3 competencies that we've talked about tonight and put them just into the end of the lesson as well. You're going to have a couple of minutes at the end of the lesson to encourage the pupil to analyse. This is where you're just winding up that lesson with a what are you pleased with, what's gone well, why has it gone well, what are we taking from today's lesson and developing further. So in other words, what's the next step for you? And that could be the drive home. So, you know, when we drop Bob off, what is it that we're going to continue to be working on? So it's that natural progression of where a pupil is in terms of at the end of the lesson, allowing them to identify that. If that means that you are offering a bit of scaffolding with your structure and your conversation, your questions, that's exactly what you're doing, basically. You're just allowing the pupil to do that analysis. It's really easy to rush that, and I have to say that that is one of the lack of competencies as a PDI who perhaps rushes that, particularly if you see the clock ticking and you're really time conscious. Not the end of the world if you've got back to the test centre 1 or 2 minutes later than perhaps you should have done. There's no point in making that last little bit last 20 seconds because you're concerned about the time. Make it last a minute and a half if it means that you're just going to get in what you need to get in. But it really can be summed up in just those 3 or 4 questions where you're encouraging the pupil to tell you how they think that it's gone and what the progress is for their next lesson or their next development. Another pitfall in this competency is to again take responsibility for it. That was really good. I'm really pleased with that lesson. Yeah, you've done really well today. Those junctions have been much better. I think we can probably move on to roundabouts next week, don't you? That's not encouraging people to analyse the lesson. It might be what you think, but it's not what the pupil necessarily thinks. So taking too much responsibility, as I said, a hangover from those other competencies. Or of course, giving incorrect feedback. And this is absolutely another trap. So particularly if you feel like the lesson hasn't gone very well and you can feel it in your bones and you're doing everything you possibly can to get people to say, yes, it was really good, Louise, thank you very much, I feel like I've learned something, and actually you're sitting there thinking, they clearly haven't, it clearly hasn't gone well. There's no point in flogging that dead horse at the end. That to get back to a test centre and have that 2 or 3 minute review that you're going to have, if you failed in the previous 40 minutes, you didn't fail here. So let's imagine that you scored a 30, so you're not far off, you know, another 1 or 2, another couple of points and you would have passed, and you scored a 1 and you're thinking, God, if I'd just got a 3 in that box I would have passed. It's not that one that's failed you. That's not the point that's failed you. It would have been the other 16 points where the priority has to be, not that one at the end. The one at the end is just accumulation of the fact that, a summary, if you like, of what's gone wrong for the last 45 minutes. So don't feel that you can save it at the end of the day. It's game over at that point.
Paul asks, could you give a reflective log to a learner to fill in and then bring back next lesson?
Yeah.
Go on, sorry.
Absolutely, you can do that. What I'd say about that is that reflective logs that we give tend very rarely to come back. That's one of the problems, is actually getting them to bring it back. Whether they even fill it out in the first place is interesting. In terms of being on a part 3, you're absolutely able to give a reflective log, but the examiners would prefer you to do that afterwards. So to not necessarily use the reflective log to sit and go through, because they acknowledge that while you're writing things out with the pupil and reflecting together, that takes longer than it would do if you were doing it verbally. And again, we've got the whole calm, moving and ventilation issue. So to go through your questions in your reflective log verbally is absolutely fine. Fill it in while the examiner's doing his own paperwork. You could do that. But in terms of what works for you on a general lesson, there are some pros and cons of giving reflective logs to pupils and asking them to bring them back. I'd say the biggest con is that they don't do it. Biggest con is they don't bring it back. The biggest pro is that your lesson gets into the house. Okay, whether it gets filled in or not, what happens is your reflective log ends up on the kitchen worktop, because that's where the pupil puts it down. A mother comes along, clears up all the stuff and says, who's this? Who does this stuff belong to? Move it, I'm trying to get dinner ready. And the mother looks at it and thinks, oh, look what they're doing in their driving lesson. That's good. Okay, there's that little bit of a subliminal showing your worth if you can get yourself into the house, if that makes sense. Don't underestimate how important that is. It might make no difference at all, but having some kind of handout that gets into the house, if it never appears again, you'll be surprised how much of an influence that can have on the people who actually pay for the driving lessons. Okay. So anything about that competency or anything else, Laura?
Ross says, could you ask maybe a few things they feel good about and then maybe one thing they still feel they need to work on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Numerous tools that you can use about that. What I would suggest is that you need to make sure that there is an appropriate number of things that they're feeling good about and an appropriate number of things to develop. And this, of course, will depend on your pupil. So I know that I have got, a number of pupils who will be able to give me 3 things that they felt have gone really well and 2 things that they'd like to continue to work on and improve. But I also know that I've got perfectionists who would struggle to come up with 3 good things. So I'm going to ask them for 2 good things or 1 good thing. So it's totally dependent. But I certainly wouldn't be doing 2 good things and 3 things to develop. Okay, so I would want to be making the positives more of a positive. So 3 good things and 2 things I want to develop, or the same. So 2 things that you're really pleased with, that you're really proud of, 2 things that you'd like to carry on and work on or get better at or improve or develop your own responsibility for. Certainly don't be using words that are negative. This is not about 2 things that are bad or 2 things that have gone wrong. That's not what this is about. This is forward thinking development solutions. So 2 things you want to get more experience of, 2 things you want to get better at, 2 things you want to learn to take more responsibility for, 2 things you've still got questions about, anything like that, you can see that that is a proactive, positive, productive, forward-thinking, solution-finding kind of questions. Okay.
Diana just said there as well, she watched your live chat about eye scanning, and she printed off some sort of driving related word searches and got her pupils to do those, and she said they were actually surprised at how well that actually helped them work.
Oh, that's nice. That's good. Fab. Thank you, Diana.
Is there a typical score that PDIs get on a part 3, and is there a sort of particular lesson, theme or subject or skill that works better for PDIs on part 3?
And let me just have a little look at a form that I've got in front of me. Is there a particular, if you were to look at the fails, I would suggest that anywhere between a 26 and a 29 is probably fairly common. If you look at the fail focuses that we get on the PDI group, it's not that often we get 30s and 31s, she says. Let me just double check my scoring. So it's not that often we're getting those. They tend to be failing in the 20s. They're not failing at 30. And also, I think it probably hasn't passed you guys by. But when we look at the passes that we get, our A's are pretty rare. Okay, so I would suggest that we're getting A's. What do you reckon, Laura? Once every 6 weeks will we get an A?
Possibly, yeah, maybe less than that sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Once every 1 to 2 months we'll get an A, and everybody else is getting B's. And I don't think that that is just a cross section of our group. I think there's a cross section of the industry, without a shadow of a doubt. Cross section of part 3s in general.
I think the one that makes me kind of think, as well as I get a lot of messages that say, I failed my part 3, but no one else in the group ever fails. And they've got to remember that not everyone posts their fails. So that's also
absolutely. I can tell you that if you've failed your part 3, so have about 16 other people who are messaging me and Laura. They're just not messaging on the group. Okay. So yeah, which is why it's really helpful to pass a fail, to post a fail, because actually those people who do post a fail, 9 times out of 10 there are 3 or 4 comments that said I failed this week too. Okay, so you will get that, absolutely.
What about a sort of particular lesson topic then, or a lesson theme that's more successful?
Okay, has to be one that's appropriate for the pupil, has to be one that's appropriate for you, has to be one appropriate for the area. Simple as that. Nothing to do with the theme. It's about what it is, how you are teaching it. However, a meaty topic, and when I mean a meaty topic, I mean one that you can really get your teeth into, that you can really exploit, and that's just juicy. That's what I'm going to say, juicy topic. And what I'd say a juicy topic is anything that's involving awareness, planning and anticipation, because actually that's what they need. So awareness, planning, anticipation, or of course stripping it right back to an MSPSL. Those things work. Something that has a very firm structure to keep you and your people on form and in line, or one that's meaty and can be exploited like awareness, planning, anticipation. On the whole, and again, this might be a really simplistic way of looking at it, a lesson that is going to the best of your ability, prevent a pupil from killing themselves or somebody else post-test is a lesson that's worthwhile. Okay? So anything that you can do that is going to be encouraging a pupil to stay alive, that's what an examiner wants to see. They want to see you justifying your road safety role. You know, that kind of, I think that's sometimes why those kind of rural roads and country lanes, those faster kind of progressive kind of stuff, that's why historically those things have gone down better than a maneuver, for example. Not that that's wrong. There's nothing wrong with doing a maneuver, but to show off some skills that demonstrate your ability to keep a pupil alive, you're not going to fail. It's as simple as that.
Stephen asked earlier then, obviously, with the announcements today from the DVSA about their recruitment drive, you know, he says, could a Part 3 examiner make a good driving instructor if they ever changed career?
Okay, tends to be the other way around. It tends to be driving instructors who become examiners, not the other way around. Okay, so driving instructors who are either ex-driving instructors or ex-PDIs. In fact, a lot of them are people who have failed 3 attempts at Part 3. It's not unusual. In fact, I wouldn't be at all surprised whether there are a number of driving instructors on the PDI group who are looking enviously at the recruitment procedure and thinking, shall I just give this up and go and become a
quite a few green badges discussing that this morning. Actually, quite a few.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that you have to be aware of, and oh God, I know it sounds really skeptical, but you have to be a little bit aware of that if you didn't make it as a driving instructor, what kind of driving instructor were you? Okay, so if you were looking to get out, you either have a very good reason for getting out. So I can tell you that I've got 2 or 3 very good friends who are driving instructors, who were examiners, who were just brilliant driving instructors. It was such a loss to the industry. They very deliberately sought out another career because they were getting married and having babies. And that actually the appeal of somebody paying them for some maternity leave was really, really strong. So actually that kind of pension, sick leave, paid holiday, 9 to 5, that kind of thing, weekends off, they were drawn to that for a particular reason. And then there are people who have failed at their jobs and are looking for something else to do. There are, of course, some fantastic examiners who have been fantastic drive instructors and vice versa. But then there are some examiners who have never been driving instructors as well. So that's, you know, that's also possible. I think you have to be a particular kind of person, but then I think you have to be a particular kind of person to be a driving instructor as well. I would do it. I would be a driving examiner if I was allowed to be like a bank driving examiner. In other words, you know, give me a call and I'll see if I'm free kind of examiner. You know, that I might fill in for you if I've got nothing better going on, but I'd like to pick and choose what I do. And I could continue being a trainer. If I could continue being a trainer, then absolutely. But never the twain shall meet. That will not ever happen. So there we go.
And Stephen just asks as well, you obviously do fail focuses. Would you ever do a pass focus?
Yeah, we could do a pass focus. I think the reason why we don't do pass focuses is people tend to do the pass focuses for themselves. The people who are pass are doing write-ups, and that's a pass focus. So we tend to kind of leave those. Yep. Okie doke. So let's move it on. Is there anything else in the box, Laura, before I move on?
And no, nothing else there.
Okay, righty ho. So let's think about Monday. So on Monday's Zoom, because we have a few days for you guys to do a bit of homework, I'm going to give you another lesson. Now, the lesson I'm going to give you is only about 15 or 16 minutes long, but it's enough for you to be reviewing what it is that we have talked about. And all I'm going to ask you to do is to watch Emma. So Emma is a PDI who's very happy for us to watch her lesson. And I want you to keep your 7 deadly sins in your mind and your terrible 2, so those other 2 extras that we keep in mind, and watch Emma with a view to be commenting on those. So I hope that today and Monday's Zooms have given you an insight into how to watch and what to look out for with Emma's lesson. I'm going to put that link on the PDI group either later this evening, might be a little bit later this evening, or tomorrow morning, and you'll be able to go via the site to find that link. And in fact, Blaine, you might put it on the bottom of, you'll put them on the bottom of the recording of this one as well, so you'll be able to find that, and that will be on tomorrow when it's edited. So that gives you a few days. As I said, it's only 15 or 16 minutes as well, so it's not going to take you too long to do that. And we'll review Emma's lesson on the Monday. And then on the Wednesday, let's look at some of the other competencies that we haven't covered in the 7 deadly sins. Sound like a plan? Give me a general nod in my direction. Thank you, everybody. You're still with me. Lovely. Okay. Does that sound okay? Goodo. We will see you all on Monday. We're obviously on the group. Laura and I are available. Blaine is also around. We will give you that link and set you your homework, and have a good few days, everybody. Oh, Blaine says let's do a live chat on Sunday for those of you that want to appear and have a listen in as well. So, okie doke. Say good night to you all. See you later.
What time Sunday?
10 o'clock. How about
Okay.
that? I answered for him. I'll make sure he's there, Paul. I'll make sure he's there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Bye, thank you.
See you later.